The idea is that Christians have fellowship, not only with other Christians who are alive on earth at the same time, but with all those believers who have gone to heaven before them. If this is so, and I believe it is, then one of those believers, one of that great cloud of witnesses mentioned in Hebrews 12, with whom I have had a deep sense of communion through the years, is C.S. Lewis. This is Pints with Jack, Season 7, Episode 11, My Journey with C.S. Lewis and Other Companions, After Hours with Will Vaus. Welcome to Pints with Jack, the podcast where we read through the works of C.S. Lewis. But today is an After Hours interview episode, so different from our regular programming with the Letters to American Lady. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, particularly because I didn't get a chance to interview Will Vaus the first time around. Andrew beat me to, as we pick the people that we interview each season, about Sheldon Van Auken and that journey. And obviously, listeners, as you guys know, I love A Severe Mercy. And so I'm just really grateful to be able to have this conversation here. And he has a very fascinating journey. And so I will dive right into his biography, and then we will dive into the interview. So today I'm joined by former guest of the show, Will Vaus. He was born in Sleepy Hollow, New York, and grew up in La Jolla, California. I actually lived in San Diego, California, in the Del Mar area for a while. So that's a fun little connection. He and his wife, Becky, have been married since 1988 and have three grown sons. I almost said have grown three sons, which would be kind of true too. His own father was Jim Vaus, former organized crime wiretapper who came to personal faith in Jesus Christ through the ministry of Billy Graham in 1949. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in drama from the University of California at San Diego, a Master of Divinity degree from Princeton Theological Seminary. He has served churches across the United States, is currently the pastor of the First Congregational Church of Yarmouth on Cape Cod. He's the president of Will Vaus Ministries and the author of 14 books, including The Man Who Received a Severe Mercy, which, as I mentioned, he discussed in Season 5. Wow, that actually is a couple years ago now. As well as the book we'll be discussing today, My Journey with C.S. Lewis and Other Companions. Welcome, Will Vaus, to Pints with Jack.
Great to be with you. I can confirm for you that I did not grow my own sons. But if anybody needs proof of miracles, take a little boy and feed him potato chips and it turns into muscle. So there's a miracle for you.
I love that. And how old are your kids now, actually?
Well, they're all grown up. The youngest is 24. Our middle son is 28. And our oldest is 30. And I have my first grandchild who's turning 2 next month.
Oh,
hard to believe.
I am so jealous. I'm 32. My sister's a little older. And so I have no kids, but I have 3 nieces that are 5, 4, and 2.5, and just the most adorable things in the entire world. And my grandparents always joke that God gives kids before grandkids because you might not want the kids after the grandkids, because you get all of the joys of being around them without the discipline and responsibility that comes with actually raising kids.
That's right. It's a really good deal.
I love that. Well, today it's not really yet past the happy hour period. And so I am just enjoying some Spindrift, some sparkling water. What are you enjoying?
I'm having almost the same thing, San Pellegrino.
Delicious. Well, cheers.
Cheers.
All right. So there's, to set the stage here a little bit, a lot of incredible stuff in here. And so I was really trying to think through, there's a lot of pivotal moments in your life from these different experiences and stories. Obviously, there's the big Lewis connection, his impact on theology. There was all of these different individuals you have met in the Lewis community that were very close to Lewis and had a relationship with him directly. Obviously, Douglas Gresham in that time period. And so as I was putting this together, I was like, all right, Holy Spirit, guide which way you want this conversation to go, because there's so many different ways this could go. And so I've put more in here than will be possible for the period that we have together. But nevertheless, we'll see what Holy Spirit takes us. So I wanted us to start out with just, if you could put in your own words, a high level overview of just kind of the different seasons or different pivotal periods in your spiritual journey that have kind of brought you from where you are to this journey as a pastor, C.S. Lewis expert, the relationships you developed with that. It was quite a journey.
Well, I like the fact that you framed that question in terms of seasons, because my book, My Journey, has a photograph on the front of Douglas Gresham and C.S. Lewis together on Addison's Walk in the autumn. And Lewis, as you probably know, wrote a little letter in the last month or so of his life in which he told his correspondent that, he thought that autumn was his favorite of the seasons, but like the autumn of life, it doesn't last, which can sound either depressing or, if you're a believer in the resurrection of the dead, as Lewis was, I think he was looking forward in hope. I just love that way of thinking about, especially our spiritual lives, in terms of seasons, and the fact that Lewis saw himself in the autumn of his life right before he died. So it kind of makes one wonder, did he view the winter of his life as the very beginning, when things were lying dormant? Because he begins, surprised by joy, by saying that he was born in the winter of 1898.
Huh.
He was born in November, which is actually in the autumn. But did he think of the first part of his life as the winter, where things were lying dormant, waiting to come to life? I don't know. It's interesting to think about one's life that way, and it's probably not something you really think very deeply about until you get to be maybe my age. You start to think about it. I turned 60 this year, so I'm just 5 years younger than C.S. Lewis was when he passed.
Wow.
So yeah, the seasons of life. Spring is the time where seeds are planted. I think of that as the first part of my life. I came to personal faith in Jesus Christ when I was about 12 or 13 years old. Had a lot of intellectual questions in the early part of my journey. That's where C.S. Lewis really helped me. And I would say that springtime of planting seeds and everything sort of lasted all the way through my time in seminary. And then I would look at like the summer of my life as the time of growth. I got married right out of seminary. 5 years later, we had children, so we had a growing marriage, growing family. And I also had the privilege of serving a number of different churches over the years in different places and seeing people, helping other people to grow spiritually and growing churches and all of that. You mentioned my time with Douglas Gresham in Ireland. In a way, I feel like I've been in the autumn of life since that time, the time where you really reap the harvest, of the things that were planted earlier on in life. So that's where I feel I am now. I hope winter is past, but winter may still be in the future. We'll see how that goes.
I'm in Michigan. Winter is right in front of me as we speak out this window. So let's dive into a little bit those early periods of your life. And I actually want to start, I'm just genuinely curious a bit about your dynamic with your father and the impact that he had in your life, that family dynamic. That was touched on briefly in the book. I know you've written an entire other book on it. So for listeners, if you're very curious, we mentioned in the beginning, he has a book called My Father Was a Gangster. And so I'm just kind of curious how that played a role in the spring season of your life.
Yeah, it's interesting when I go and speak at C.S. Lewis events, and then there's a book table, and if I have that book, My Father Was a Gangster, next to some of the works that I've written about C.S. Lewis, people look at it and go, is this fiction? And I tell them, no, actually not. My father really was a gangster. He worked for Mickey Cohen back in the 1940s in Los Angeles. These days, a lot of people seem to know about Mickey Cohen, maybe because there was a movie a few years ago with Sean Penn called Gangster Squad. Anyway, my father worked for the mob and did wiretapping, electronic surveillance He also did pass-post betting on the racehorses. The movie The Sting with Paul Newman and Robert Redford was really based on my father's story of pass-post betting on the racehorses using electronics to do that. That was sort of the midpoint of my father's life. And then suddenly he came to personal faith in Jesus Christ through the ministry of Billy Graham while he was involved in organized crime. And he quit organized crime. He paid back everyone he'd ever cheated or stolen from, and basically spent the rest of his life, serving the Lord, trying to point other people to Jesus. I came along later in his life, but as a result of that, the impact on me was that, I saw somebody who obviously their life was changed by a spiritual encounter. And so I never had any doubts about that aspect of faith. I had a lot of intellectual questions, but I could see the psychological and emotional impact of faith because of my father and my mother as well.
There's a number of different sections as you bring your father up. I mean, first of all, it sounds like just really incredible how, I remember when you were talking about, did he have this, I might butcher it slightly, but this runaway hotline for people that ran away, and he just didn't exactly know how this was going to work, but his personality was just, we'll just figure it out. This needs to be done. Which, first of all, I love that personality. When there's something good, you do it. You don't need it to be perfect until you do it. It's worth doing something good, even if it's not done properly. But anyways, and you mentioned that had an impact on you. And I think right around this season, so you have that go on. And wasn't this right around the same time period where there was some stress going on from the workload and you had to pull out from UCSD, and there was an individual that had committed suicide, and that had a pretty big impact in your life early on? Can you kind of just talk about all of that period?
Yeah, a lot was going on in my life in that period when I was in college. And yes, my father, his whole life, because of what he had gone through, and he had a real compassion for young people. He had committed his first crime while he was still a teenager, armed robbery. When he came to faith in Christ, he wanted to help other young people going through the same sorts of things he'd been through. And late in his life, that led him to want to establish a nationwide youth crisis hotline, a runaway hotline. Our family lived in San Diego at the time. Since you're from San Diego, you may be aware of this. Of course, now we're more aware of all the people coming over the border into our country legally and illegally. In those days, in the 70s and early 80s, the greater concern was with the runaway youth population that would end up in San Diego because it was a warm place where kids could sleep on the street or on the beach in the winter. And so my father was seeing that problem and wanted to establish this hotline, but he knew how he was going to work the electronic aspect of it, and he knew all about telephones and all about how all of that should work. But my question to him when it began, and I was probably, I guess I was a junior in college, and I said, how are you going to advertise it? How are you going to help kids all over the country find out about this? And he said, I don't know, but we're going to do it.
I love that.
He was a visionary like that. And it was amazing because in the early days of that hotline, word about it got out, and a number of companies came on board to work with us. The yellow pages across the country advertised it. And then there was even a special, if I remember, on CBS, because they got interested in it. So my involvement with it was that I was working for my father's organization at the same time while I was in college. And he asked me if I would take the calls that were after hours, ties into our program for today. I said, sure. I don't think I really had a choice about that, but he was my boss telling me that's what he wanted me to do. And at the time, it was like no big deal, maybe a few calls at best would be coming in. We went from just a few calls a month to first 1,000 calls a month and then 6,000 calls a month.
Wow.
During the time that I was working on the hotline. So I was regularly woken up in the middle of the night to talk to a kid, who was on the street across the country from me. And in many cases, they didn't know, I was somebody just a couple years older than they were, trying to help them and get them to shelters, and which was the main thing, but also trying to encourage them along the way. And yeah, it was a huge eye opener to what a lot of kids were going through then. And of course, it's still happening in our country today.
What's so beautiful about that story is there's like a Lewisian theme embedded in that of when we get to Mere Christianity, where Lewis talks about how when some of the greatest vices can become the greatest virtues. A cow can't really be much special. It's got nothing good or bad really going on. It's just going to be kind of what is. And I think of your father's journey that you sort of shared. There's this very colored past, but like it was used in a more negative way at first.
Right.
And then just that those gifts and talents then when turned for the positive became an extreme positive. I mean, 6,000 a month, what a gift. I mean, that's just so beautiful to see that those talents and that drive and that vision, ambition just repurposed in such a beautiful way for the kingdom. I love that. So thanks for sharing that. So you have this your early childhood. Let's turn to when Lewis first entered the picture for you.
Well, I was pretty young, 9 years old, fourth grade public school in Southern California. My teacher read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe to our class. I think it was sort of in the lead up to Christmas time. My family was involved in church at that time, but I did not make any connection between Narnia and the Bible or Christianity or any of that. It just overwhelmed me as a story. Mm-hmm. And I was just enchanted from the very beginning of that and hearing it in school. And then when our teacher finished reading to us, she said, this is the first of 7 books. And so I went home and asked my parents to buy me the books, which was an unusual thing for me to do because I wasn't much of a reader. I was a very slow reader. But that book became the beginning sort of a journey for me of a lifetime of reading, which is really what my book, My Journey, is about. It's not just a biography, but it's really more of what I would call a literary memoir about how books can transform our lives. And so that was the first. That's where it began for me with Lewis. But again, I had no idea it had anything to do with Christianity. I was only 9 years old. I had no idea who C.S. Lewis was or that he'd written any other books. I just loved those stories.
First of all, I just love that there's an overlap with that to Lewis's life. I mean, just such a similarity there of books at his early age, actually around the age of 9, played such an impactful role in his life and just guiding him through tough periods. And you had from your biography a significant amount of like just tough periods and ups and downs too early on, and some bullying that happened in school. And that
was something I wasn't totally aware of or didn't really think about until many years later, that when you get to the silver chair, there's this story of bullying going on. Mm-hmm. And it was many, many years before I knew anything about C.S. Lewis's life and found out that he went through the same thing. He kind of escaped into books. And the same thing happened for me in a time when I was being bullied in school. I escaped into books. I escaped into Narnia. So yes, an amazing connection there that I didn't realize until many years later, sort of looking back on it.
I love that. You had a number of impactful trips then as well that really started to bring you closer to Lewis and bring you more on this journey. I'd love to dive into a couple of them if possible. First one with the Ireland trip and some of the experiences on that trip and how they kind of fit into the bigger context of your story and you're ultimately coming more and more integrated with Lewis.
Right. So to set the stage for that, so I began with Lewis reading the Narnia stories. I didn't know he'd written anything else. By the time I was in 9th grade, so between 4th and 9th grade, I was just reading the Narnia stories for the first time. By the time I was in 9th grade, my aunt, I think for Christmas, bought me a book called The Joyful Christian, 131 readings in C.S. Lewis, which was just right for me at that stage of my life. I don't think I could have handled, reading Mere Christianity or any of his other nonfiction books, but they were just these little snippets in The Joyful Christian that addressed a lot of intellectual questions I was starting to have about my faith. I had just come to personal faith in Christ when I was about 13. So now about the time I was 14, starting to have a lot of questions. And Lewis really helped that way. For a period of time in middle school, I wasn't involved in church at all. And then through a friend down the street who invited me to go to youth group, I got introduced to church and youth group. And my youth pastor was a huge C.S. Lewis fan. So he encouraged the reading of Lewis and often would read little snippets of Lewis's books. And so then I went from The Joyful Christian to try to start reading some of Lewis's books. In fact, I read Letters to an American Lady when I was in high school. I tried Mere Christianity for the first time, but didn't get very far. Tried Screwtape Letters, didn't get very far, but started to make an attempt at reading some of his other books. So then by the time I was in college, I was really deeply intrigued by Lewis, the little bit I knew about his life and the books I was reading. And I was determined that I was going to read everything that C.S. Lewis wrote. And I decided the way I wanted to start doing that was to travel to the United Kingdom and visit the places where Lewis had lived and wrote his books, and take the books along with me that I hadn't read yet. I went to my father and told him what I wanted to do. I didn't have the money to do it. He graciously paid for the trip. I spent about 4 weeks traveling around the British Isles. I was 19 years old. I went by myself, which I guess now looking back on it sounds a little bit brave. I didn't think about it that way.
Yeah.
It was just what I wanted to do. So I read a whole bunch of Lewis for the first time on that trip.
Wow. I'm literally thinking of, because you also did the Holy Land trip. I remember the first time I went to the Holy Land, and you kind of had an experience when you went there, but we were walking in the footsteps of Jesus, and we were reading just a bunch of the different sermons and parables that he was doing. And I'm loving that you did this for Lewis as well.
Yes. Now, to be sure, Lewis is not on the same level as Jesus. I don't look at him that way. Some people wonder, do I believe in a holy quadrilateral instead of a holy trinity? But let me just set the record straight. I do not. Oh. Lewis, as a follower of Jesus, has been a great help to me in pointing the way. And it was fun to sort of walk in his footsteps, though I wouldn't have put it that way at the time, and to see the places where he lived. And when you go to a place that has really impacted books that you like to read, it gives you a whole nother dimension to it. I'm sure you've experienced that. It flavors your whole reading. Lewis was kind of famous for denying the biographical element, in his writing, or really in anybody's writing. He really believed we shouldn't read books through the lens of the biography of the author. But, Lewis shares a lot of himself nonetheless in his books, and certainly the places where he lived impacted, the books that he wrote, including Narnia, which he says, Ireland, certain parts of Ireland, the landscape and everything, really influenced, what he was describing in terms of the landscape of Narnia.
I'm torn between going to a little bit on the Christian theology and how Lewis influenced it, or actually going to your C.S. Lewis trip in England and Oxford. Let's go to your C.S. Lewis trip, and not the Ireland one, but the one in England, and just because you met incredible amounts of people. By this point, you're now even deeper and deeper into Lewis, into the expert world and stuff. But that played a really big role too in a lot of these relationships you developed and the people you met and conversations you had. That was just an incredible period. I was just enthralled as I was kind of reading through this and jealous at the same time.
Well, so how did I get to that point? So I had this journey when I was in college that took me deeper into C.S. Lewis. And then after college, I went to seminary because I really felt called to Christian ministry and wanted to have a proper preparation for that. And didn't read a whole lot of Lewis while I was in seminary. It came up from time to time, and I continued to find Lewis helpful. And so then graduated from seminary, got married, started to have a family, started to pastor churches. And I had a period in about 1996, thereabouts, where I kind of had a revival of my interest in Lewis. And I decided that, I really wanted to share it with other people and learn from other people in reading books together. So I started a C.S. Lewis Society where I was living at the time in Columbia, South Carolina. That was an amazing experience. We met in a Barnes & Noble. I advertised in the local newspaper. We had 30 people show up for our first meeting.
That's amazing.
And then along with that, I got really interested in trying to make contact with and meet and discuss Lewis with people who had known him. So it was out of that time period that I started writing by email to Douglas Gresham. Douglas Gresham introduced me to Walter Hooper and to George Sayer. And at the same time, I made contact with Sheldon Van Auken and met him for the first time. So that's where all of that interest came. And it was while I was starting the C.S. Lewis Society. With Doug's help and encouragement, I put together a little C.S. Lewis tour and led a group of people over to England. We didn't do Ireland on that first trip, but we went to Great Malvern, where Lewis had gone to prep school, and we went to Oxford and Cambridge and London. I think that's pretty much what we did on that trip. And George Sayer spoke to our group in Malvern, and Walter Hooper spoke to our group in Oxford. And then George Watson, who'd been a colleague of Lewis's at Cambridge, spoke to us there. And Doug Gresham spent 3 days with us in Oxford, showing our group all around and introduced us to the kilns. And it was an incredible time.
This might be putting you on the spot a little bit, but I'm intrigued with some of those conversations of just, if you remember some of the stuff that came out of some of those. I mean, you're talking with, I should not be making this analogy again, the Holy Land analogy, and you correctly, Lewis is not Jesus. I feel like it's like talking with the apostles or the people that were close to Jesus, and then you hear these stories. It's like talking with the people that knew Lewis directly and hearing their stories. And obviously, a lot of this stuff has been captured in books, but there's just something about hearing it directly from someone who just saw the way they light up. I mean,
exactly. And it's like going to a place that influenced a person. When you meet the other people who were impacted by that person, the ideal would obviously be to meet Lewis, which I always explain to people. My book is called My Journey with C.S. Lewis and Other Companions. I've only journeyed with C.S. Lewis through his books, but meeting people who knew him, that colors my view of who he was and what he was like. And so it transforms, and enriches my reading of his books. And there's lots of things I remember from that particular trip. I don't have my journal in front of me, but I kept a very detailed journal. Every night I would write down the things that we had heard that day. My wife kept notes, during the talks that we had from George Sayer and all the others, because I couldn't do that because we kind of did an interview style, and I was doing the interviewing. But so I have really detailed notes. The thing that really struck me about George Sayer was just his humility. Towards the end of our time together, I was actually talking to him on the phone, and I said, "I wish I had more time to pick your brain." And he said, "You'd be entitled to as much as my brain as I have left."
Oh, that's really the sweet comment.
And he was just a dear, dear person that way, and just, willing to share of all of his memories. And on that trip, I didn't get to know Walter Hooper very well. That was just the beginning of my knowing Walter Hooper. But from there, that led to my spending many more hours with Walter Hooper and getting to know him pretty well. And it was also kind of the beginning of my friendship with Douglas Gresham. It was the first time we met face to face, and that relationship, that friendship has flourished over the years. Yeah, there's a lot of memories that come to mind.
Yeah, let's circle back to the Douglas one in a bit, but what was Walter Hooper like in some of those conversations that you had with him?
Also a very humble person who just obviously loved C.S. Lewis, loved the works of C.S. Lewis, and devoted his life to making sure that all of Lewis's works stayed in print, devoted his life to expanding the collection of Lewis's letters that were in print, that work that was begun by Lewis's brother Warney. And that was incredible. I remember so many times visiting Walter in his home in Oxford in later years, and in his little home office, he had a number of shelves devoted to Lewis's letters. He had volumes of the actual letters, not the originals, but I think photocopies of them, which he obviously used in putting together the collected letters, and of course, Walter's own journey was amazing. He obviously eventually converted to the Catholic Church and all of that. And so we talked about that on a number of occasions. Not my first time meeting him, but in later years. And another thing I loved about being in Walter's home was all of the first editions, he had of Lewis's works. Same thing with Sheldon Van Auken. But Walter had, many of the books from Lewis's library,
Wow,
which were incredible to look at. I remember the first time I visited with him in his home, seeing Lewis's copy of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, seeing the book about Norse mythology that Lewis had been given as a prize when he was in prep school. Just holding those and realizing the impact that those books had had on C.S. Lewis was incredible.
I'm curious if you can articulate, you have these meetings with all these individuals. You've already come in at this point, like you were saying, you're much more in your formation journey already and strong in your faith. What kind of impact did this have on your theology or your spiritual journey? Did it just make you go a little bit deeper with the relationship with Christ? Were there so many like meaningful theological shifts where you're talking with these people that are so incredible and you're like, whoa, I need to rethink this part of my systematic theology, or I need to be more focused on this? I mean, just being around these individuals, was there anything like that came out of this?
Certainly a long and gradual process over time. The beginning of that theological impact was going back to my college years, and when I read Mere Christianity all the way through for the first time when I was on that trip to the British Isles, and I finished the book while I was in Donegal. I had a head cold. It was raining cats and dogs outside. I was sort of confined to my bed. I didn't feel like going anywhere. And that's when I finished reading Mere Christianity. And I can remember being in that same little room and reading that famous part about, that's been characterized as a liar, lunatic, Lord. Lewis didn't put it in those words exactly, but that was one of my biggest intellectual questions, was why should I go on believing that Jesus was divine? What intellectual reasons are there for believing that? And so Lewis really helped me with that. Then as the years went on, yes, he definitely has shaped my theology in many ways. The first book that I published on Lewis was Mere Theology, A Guide to C.S. Lewis's Thought by InterVarsity Press. And so, that book kind of outlines, even though I don't say, where I agree with him or disagree with him, I pretty much agree with him on a lot of things. And so each chapter in that book, all of those different themes have influenced me. I think one of the big ones also would be Lewis's view of Scripture, that the Bible is human literature lifted up to be the vehicle of God's communication to us. And if I could have fully absorbed that when I was in seminary, it would have saved me a lot of blood, sweat, and tears over that whole issue, of what exactly is the Bible. Lewis just puts it so well in Reflections on the Psalms. So, that's just a couple places where Lewis has influenced me. I guess another one would be stemming out of his biography, just the fact that he submitted himself to the discipline of meeting with a spiritual director and practicing confession to a priest, even though he wasn't Catholic, even though it wasn't required of him as an Anglican. He did it for his own spiritual growth. So that led me eventually to seek out the same thing. I spent about 4 years in spiritual direction with a Catholic priest. That was a very impactful season in my life, but I wouldn't have thought of doing that if it hadn't been for C.S. Lewis's example.
You might be acting as a nudge for the Lord right now, because I have been, for the last 6 months, the Lord has been nudging me to seek a Catholic priest for spiritual direction. So this might be another sign here.
These days there's all sorts of people that practice spiritual direction. And so it's really a matter of finding somebody that's a fit for you. I tried it with one other person before I found the right fit with the particular Catholic priest that I went to. I could just as well have fallen in with somebody from a different, Presbyterian or Methodist or whatever. In my case, it happened to be a Catholic priest. So it was a time of learning for me about Catholic doctrine as well, not because the priest foisted it on me, but because I had questions. I said, can we discuss the Catholic Catechism together? And he's like, sure, yeah, we can do that.
In the order of your timeline, was this before or after you had your conversations with Sheldon? Because I know obviously his journey ended up leading there.
Many years after that, yes. Yes, I had many conversations with Sheldon Van Auken about his journey into the Catholic Church and his beliefs. I'm sure at times it felt to him like I was trying to convert him back to being a Protestant. He wanted to assure me that he wasn't really trying to convert me, but he was open to discussing many things. And we had some great conversations. And over a number of letters, he sent me every single Catholic Answer tract that he had. Some of our listeners may know about Catholic Answers. And that was a great source of things to discuss. And we had great conversations together. I'm still Protestant, by the way,
but being in San Diego, and our other co-host David is in San Diego. His wife used to work for Catholic Answers. And so we've been very fortunate to have a fun relationship with Trent Horn from the Council of Trent we had him on to talk about objective morality from Lewis's perspective. I guess Trent had just written a book on objective morality.
Very important.
Yes. And one that actually, out of all of Lewis's things, that was the hardest one for me to fully understand as the argument for God.
Well, The Abolition of Man is a difficult book, even though it's a slim little volume. It's dense. And so you have to go really slowly through it.
Yes. So speaking of Sheldon here, before we circle back to your time with Douglas and Merrie, listeners, you can go to the season 5 conversation with him. So we're going to keep this. We won't dive into too much to this, but for anyone who's new, obviously, as seasons have gone by, we've gained new listeners, lost listeners probably. And so you have a little bit of turnover. What would you say is like one of the best things about A Severe Mercy? Like if you were to tell them, hey, go check out A Severe Mercy. This is a wonderful book because you're going to learn things about this. What would be kind of your little pitch for A Severe Mercy, being someone who knows it so well?
The only way I have of explaining it is to explain how I came to the book. So remember, I had this youth pastor in junior high and high school and in college who was this huge C.S. Lewis fan. His name is Sonny Salisbury. Sonny, if you're listening to this, this is a tribute to you. Part of our youth group was involved in a teen choir, and he would lead us on a special choir tour at least once a year. But to be able to go on the choir tour, you had to read books. Other than the Bible, you had to read Christian books. And even while we were on the tour, he would pass around a box of books for us to pick out what we were going to read while we were on the trip together. And so here we were on this bus driving from San Diego all the way up the coast to the Canadian border. And he passed this box of books around, and there were a bunch of paperbacks, and I reached in and pulled out this book that stood out to me because C.S. Lewis's name was in really bold print on the cover of this paperback called A Severe Mercy. But it wasn't by C.S. Lewis. It's by Sheldon Van Auken. And then it said, 18 previously unpublished letters from C.S. Lewis. So I thought, oh, this sounds interesting. Had no idea what the book was about. And I started into the first chapter and I gave up. I absolutely gave up in the first chapter. And over the years, I've talked to many people who've tried to read the book and I had the same experience their first time trying to read through it. They got bogged down in the first chapter and they don't go any farther. So that's the first thing is when you pick up the book, make sure you keep going after the first chapter because it gets better and it gets easier.
It's fantastic advice.
And now I love the whole book and I love that first chapter. But at the time, it just didn't have enough action for me. But the book is really 3 books in one. It's a love story, it's a conversion story, and it's a grief story. And here I was, a young guy reading it. The grief part of the story didn't mean as much to me then as it does now, but I was fascinated with his conversion story, identified with a lot of it, even though I was very different in many ways, and also the love story, because I was an idealistic young guy and I read that and I thought, oh, I want to go out and find my Davy, his wife's nickname. I've been married for 35 years now. I remember when I gave the book to my wife to read, when she got to the part where Van and Davy decide they're going to share everything, including all the books that they've read, they would read all the books that each other had read before they met each other. My wife turned to me and said, if you think I'm going to do that, you have another thing coming. Because here I'd been to seminary and read a lot of books she was simply not interested in. But so I have a much more realistic view of marriage now than the idealistic view I had when I first read the book. But I would say, the long-winded answer to say the one thing that stands out to me about the book is the same thing that stands out to me about C.S. Lewis, that Lewis and Van Auken both talk about these eternal longings that we have that are not satisfied by anything in this life, in this world, which Lewis says is an argument for the fact that we were made for another world. And basically, Van Auken says the same thing. But here's the real plus. Lewis writes and Van Auken writes in such a way that he doesn't just tell you about these longings. Their writing stirs the longing in you by the way that they write, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. Lewis is much better at it, I would say, honestly, than Van Auken is. But Van Auken, at least in A Severe Mercy, is great at it too. The reading that book just stirs these immortal longings.
I don't think I've ever had someone, or at least it didn't hit me, point that out, that truth. I obviously am very aware with Lewis writing about the role of longing. I don't think I've ever put out Lewis has stirred longing within me. And you're so right. My 10-second journey was from atheism to reading Mere Christianity in a very dark period and realizing, I don't know if this is true, but this seems like this would bring joy and happiness, which is kind of another way of saying there's some longing that was stirred in me as I'm reading Mere Christianity of like, this seems like it's tapping into something I've been searching for in 10 other ways that has been failing miserably up until this point in my life. I really like that. Thanks for putting it in that framework.
I like hearing what your journey is because it's the flip side of mine. I knew Christianity and faith in Christ could be emotionally transformative, could make a person supremely, maybe not happy, but joyful.
Yep.
But I wasn't sure whether it was true.
You are. We were the opposites there a little bit.
And so reading C.S. Lewis helped to convince me that, yes, indeed, it is true.
I love that.
I was kind of like Lewis in that way, in that I didn't trust myself fully to give myself, fully, because it's like it says in the Bible, we're called to love the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our mind, with all our soul, and all our strength. And Lewis has really helped me with the mind part. But then secondarily, the longings, of our hearts. Lewis just speaks to that. He stirs it in you by the way he writes and points you to where the satisfaction can be found.
I love that. That's so well said. Well, for this last part here, let's finally circle up to the Douglas and Merrie. I was honestly quite unexpected. I did not know you had that in your life when I came across that. And I'm really glad you really developed that chapter and dove into that pretty deeply, because I thought that was a really cool, unique experience in many senses that I think a lot of people would love a little glimpse into. So can you just set that up of what this period was? You're invited there, what that looks like, what your day looks like, kind of how that ended up impacting you in the long run to where you are now today?
Yes. Well, and I'm still a friend of Douglas Gresham. Like I said earlier, he gave me permission to use this photograph of he and Jack on Addison's Walk that was taken in 1960, shortly after Joy Davidman Lewis passed away from cancer. And the photograph is actually taken by Doug's biological father, Bill Gresham, who went over to England for a visit with his sons in the autumn of 1960. I came to know Douglas Gresham during that time when I was starting a C.S. Lewis Society for the first time, and I wanted to get to know other people who knew Lewis. And so our friendship began through email. And I was not just asking him questions about Lewis and about his own life. I read his autobiography, Lenten Lands, which is a wonderful book. I read that for the first time right before I started emailing him. He is, in his own way, such a caring person, that he wasn't satisfied with just giving me answers about what he had experienced about Lewis. He asked about my own life, and we quickly became friends. And then, like I said, I met him for the first time on that C.S. Lewis tour I led to England with my wife. And from the first, getting to know Doug and learning about the ministry that he and his wife had in Ireland called Rathvinden. That was the name of their house, Rathvinden House, in Lochlanbridge, County Carlow, about 60 miles southwest of Dublin. And God had led them through a series of circumstances to establish themselves in this house and to open their house, which was this 12-bedroom Irish country house on 20 acres. And they opened their home to whoever God would bring to them. But they didn't advertise. They didn't advertise. They weren't like most Americans who, Doug used to say, Americans are great for asking the question, what is your vision for your ministry? And
that's me.
He would say, we don't have a vision for our ministry. It's God's vision. And, we're just opening ourselves to him. And we believe God wanted us to open our home to whoever God would send to us. And so that's what they did. And from the first hearing about that, I thought, I really want to visit them over there and see what their ministry is like in this place where they're living. So my wife and I and our kids, we went there for the first time in 2002. And then in the following year, I went through a huge transition in my life where I needed to step out of ministry for a period of time and just have a time of renewal in my life. I compare it to like when a washing machine goes out of balance, and you hear the thump, thump, thump. My life was like that at the time. It was just out of balance and it was starting to thump, and I needed to turn off the washing machine and reorganize everything. And that was the point in time at which Doug and Merrie opened their home to us, not only to come and have a time of renewal, but to engage with them in the ministry that they had there. So we picked up roots and moved to Ireland, not knowing how long we were going to stay there. This was in 2004, and our invitation to stay there was actually until June of 2005. We ended up actually staying there with them for about 8 months, and that was during the time when they were making the first Narnia movie of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and the filming was happening in New Zealand. And Doug was traveling back and forth a lot, and he wanted to be able to take Merrie with him, but they needed to have somebody they felt they could trust to look after the ministry and their home while they were away. And so our being there enabled them to do that. And our kids had a wonderful time living in Ireland for 8 months and going to an Irish school. And yeah, it was an incredible time of renewal in our lives.
What was one or two things that came out of that, like just conversations with potentially other people that were there or Douglas or them, that just really had an impact on you in your family and maybe your theology, your prayer life, your relationship with Christ, maybe what you decided to do afterwards? I mean, it sounds like, if I'm understanding this correctly, you were more in the capacity of like a one below, but like partner with Douglas. So the other people were coming and staying in these other rooms. So you're meeting other people as well.
Yes. Yeah. We had people visiting from all over the world,
Wow.
from England and South Africa and America and just all over. And so that was an amazing experience too. All the other people that we got to meet, some of whom we're still in touch with all these years later. There were just so many everyday sorts of things that happened during that time that were so special. We began every day in prayer with Doug and Merrie. We would meet with them and just commit our day to the Lord together every day. Just so many things happened in the course of our everyday work. A lot of what we helped with was Merrie is a very keen gardener, and she had this huge garden and orchard that they basically lived off of. They didn't raise any meat, so that was one of the few things they would buy. They lived off the vegetables and the fruit and everything that they grew. And so a lot of our work centered around helping in the garden and taking care of guests and cleaning around the house. And so there were things that came up in just every day going about our work. And I'll read you one of them. One day we were working in the garden, and Merrie was hanging out clothes to dry on her clothesline. And she looked at the sky and said, "Rain may be coming later. I might have to hang these clothes to dry in the airing cupboard." "What did you say?" I practically shouted across the garden. I said, "I might have to put these clothes in the airing cupboard." "Where is the airing cupboard? Can you show it to me?"
I wouldn't know.
I knew the request sounded strange to Merrie, but I really did not know what an airing cupboard was. I had read the phrase in a letter written by C.S. Lewis, and so I was anxious to see such a cupboard. Merrie led me inside her house to an upstairs hallway. She opened a large closet with a water heater and said, "That's my airing cupboard." Any warm cupboard would do for hanging wet clothes up to dry on a rainy day. I thanked Merrie and then shared with her the Lewis quote as I remembered it. Lewis once wrote these words to a former student whom he was able to lead to faith in Jesus Christ. "I know all about the despair of overcoming chronic temptations. It is not serious, provided self-offended petulance, annoyance at breaking records, impatience, etc., doesn't get the upper hand. No amount of falls will really undo us if we keep on picking ourselves up each time. We shall, of course, be very muddy and tattered children by the time we reach home. But the bathrooms are all ready, the towels put out, and the clean clothes are in the airing cupboard. The only fatal thing is to lose one's temper and give it up. It is when we notice the dirt that God is most present to us. It is the very sign of his presence." And that just became my favorite C.S. Lewis quote at that time, because I was very much right there at that point that Lewis describes of seeing a lot of dirt in my life. And Lewis was so encouraging that, all I needed to focus on was just getting up. and taking the next step. And Christ will see to it that we make it home in the end.
Honestly, I don't think we could have scripted a better last thing to leave the listeners with. So beautiful.
That is what I'd want to leave everybody with.
That's always my goal with any conversation. It's, and whenever just talking about Lewis is just some sort of takeaway that people can have in their lives. And so I love that. Well, Will, thank you for coming on the show. And before we kind of sign off here, where can listeners learn more about you? So buy a copy of the specific book, any of your other resources, any online presence that you have.
So I have a website, willvaus.com. That's WILLV, like in victory, AUS.com. I also have a blog, willvaus.blogspot.com. So I'm on Blogger, so you can find me there. And all my books are available on Amazon. You can find out about all the books there. If any of the listeners want a signed copy, they can write to me directly and we can arrange that.
That is awesome. Well, I hear the call for the final drinks. And so thank you again, Will, for coming on the show. And thanks to our sound engineers, Taylor and Sarah, and to all of our listeners and Patreon supporters, particularly our top tier supporters, Alex, James, Matt, Erica, Joelle, Amanda, Thomas, Bud, Shane, Kay, Paul, Gary, Stephen, Kelly, Chris, John, James, Kate, Peter, David, Angela, and Rowdy. And we pray for all of our listeners and all the prayer requests in our Slack channel every Tuesday. And if you enjoyed this episode, please write to us telling us about it. We'll pass this along, or you can email Will directly. We always love just hearing you guys' thoughts when you hear these things. And so please join us next time when we'll continue going further up
and further in.
Cheers.
Cheers.